There is a kind of vertigo that arrives with the first real understanding of how Golden Age pirates actually organized themselves. And it is the specific vertigo of realizing that something you had assumed was primitive was, in several measurable respects, considerably more advanced than the arrangements you yourself are currently living under. Take a moment with that. You live in a country that holds elections every few years. You participate in those elections, or you don't, but when you do participate, your vote is one of many millions, processed through a system whose mechanics you have probably never seen directly, producing outcomes that may or may not reflect what you actually voted for, and that will, in most cases, govern aspects of your life over which you have very little practical control. This is what we mean by democracy in the modern world, and it is, on balance, considerably better than the alternatives. Now imagine, instead, that you wake up tomorrow in a society of approximately 100 people. Every important decision that society makes, where it goes, what it does, who leads it, how it shares the wealth it generates, is decided by a vote in which your voice carries exactly the same weight as everyone else's. Not metaphorically, not after several layers of representation and procedural intermediation. Directly, your hand goes up, or it does not. Your name gets called, and you say yes or you say no. And your yes or your no counts for exactly 1/100th of the outcome. Welcome to a pirate ship. This was the most radical thing about the Golden Age pirates, and it is the place I want to begin our tour, because once you see it clearly, the rest of the picture rearranges itself around it. The vote was not a courtesy. The vote was not a ceremonial gesture extended downward by a captain who could revoke it whenever he chose. The vote was structural. It was the load-bearing element of the entire enterprise, written into the articles that every man signed before the voyage began, enforced by the same crew that had granted it, and applied to decisions that under any other contemporary maritime arrangement would have been the exclusive privilege of the man at the top of the chain of command. Where shall we sail next? Vote. Shall we attack that vessel on the horizon, or let it pass? Vote. The man we elected captain last month has begun making decisions we find questionable. What shall we do about him? Vote. 2 crew members are in dispute over the division of some particular item of plunder. How shall we settle it? Vote. The texture of life inside this arrangement is almost impossible to convey from inside the modern condition, because the modern condition has trained us to expect that most of what happens to us is decided by other people. Our employers decide what time we wake up. Our governments decide what we owe and what we receive. Our landlords decide where we sleep. Our institutions decide what we can and cannot do with the bodies we live inside. We have grown so accustomed to this distribution of authority that we have largely stopped noticing it, which is the way distributed authority always operates, by becoming invisible enough that the people living under it stop perceiving themselves as living under anything at all. The pirates noticed. The pirates had spent years living under exactly that kind of distributed authority on legitimate vessels, where the captain's word was law, and the captain's accountability to the men he commanded was, for all practical purposes, non-existent. They had been beaten. They had been cheated. They had been denied wages that were owed to them with the calm assurance of men who knew that the legal system existed to protect employers rather than employees. They had watched their fellow sailors die from injuries that adequate compensation might have prevented, from diseases that adequate provisions might have forestalled, from punishments imposed for offenses that had been defined by the very people imposing the punishments. And when they finally stepped onto a pirate vessel, articles in hand, and looked around at the men who were about to become their crewmates, they saw something they had never seen before in their working lives. They saw equals, not theoretical equals, not equals in some abstract philosophical sense that could be conveniently set aside whenever inconvenient. Equals in the most concrete and verifiable way possible. Equals in the count of votes. The Welshman next to you got 1 vote. The Irishman across from you got 1 vote. The escaped slave who had joined the crew last month after his slave ship had been taken and the articles had been offered to him. He got 1 vote. The man who had just been elected captain, the man whose tactical decisions in battle would determine whether you lived or died in the next engagement. He got 1 vote. This was not how the 18th century worked anywhere else. The 18th century, on land, was organized around an extraordinary and elaborate hierarchy of differentiated worth. Kings counted more than nobles. Nobles counted more than gentlemen. Gentlemen counted more than commoners. Commoners counted more than servants. Servants counted more than slaves. Slaves counted, in many places and many contexts, as something close to nothing at all. The entire architecture of European and colonial society was built on the principle that human beings were arranged in a vertical column of value, and that your place in that column was determined by accidents of birth that could not be revised by anything you might subsequently accomplish. The pirates flattened the column. Not entirely, not perfectly. The captains still received 2 shares to the common sailors' 1, and certain specialists got their proportional increases, and the column was not so much abolished as compressed into something resembling a slight slope rather than a sheer cliff. But the compression was profound enough that men who had spent their entire lives looking up at people who counted more than they did suddenly found themselves in a room where their hand, raised in a vote, counted for exactly the same as every other hand in that room. The psychological consequences of this are difficult to overstate. Men who have been told their entire lives that they do not matter, when placed in a situation where they suddenly do matter, behave differently. They commit, they invest, they fight harder for the outcome of decisions they had a hand in making than for decisions imposed on them from above. They become, in ways that the legitimate maritime employers of the era never seemed to grasp, the most motivated workforce on the seas. The vote was the foundation. Everything else we will discuss in the next 9 sections of this documentary is built on top of it, drawing its meaning and its operational reality from the simple, radical, almost shocking premise that on a pirate vessel, your voice counted. But the vote was not the only thing the articles guaranteed. The vote was the beginning. The next thing we need to talk about is what the rest of the document said. Best 2, the written articles. We need to spend a moment with the document itself because the document is one of the most genuinely strange and underappreciated artifacts in the history of the early modern world. And once you grasp what it actually was, the question of why it has not received more attention from historians and screenwriters and political theorists becomes itself an interesting question. The articles were a written constitution, not a vague set of agreements understood loosely among the crew, not a captain's word, generously offered and freely revocable. A written, signed, contractually binding document, produced before the voyage began, agreed to in specific and enforceable terms by every man aboard, and held as a kind of operating manual for the entire social and economic and military life of the vessel. The articles of Bartholomew Roberts survive in detailed form, and they are worth dwelling on. They specify the equal vote we have already discussed. They specify the division of plunder. They specify the rules of behavior aboard. No fighting between crewmates aboard the ship. Disputes had to be settled on land, with formal procedure, witnessed by neutral parties. No women aboard, in some versions, and not for the prudish reasons one might initially suspect, but for the practical recognition that introducing partners and their potential conflicts into a closed space of armed men was a recipe for the very violence the articles were specifically designed to prevent. Lights out at a certain hour, gambling restricted in specific ways, provisions for what happened to a man's share if he was killed before payday, and whether his provisions for a designated beneficiary. In a pirate ship, in 1721, I want you to sit with that, because the implications travel further than they first appear. The articles did not merely protect you while you were alive. They protected the people you cared about in the event of your death. They were, in this specific respect, doing something that life insurance contracts were just beginning to do in legitimate society. And they were doing it for men who, under any other available framework, had no recourse to anything resembling life insurance at all. The articles assumed your death. They expected your death. They were written by people who had been at this work long enough to know the actuarial reality, and rather than pretending the danger was not there, they incorporated it into the document. If you die, here is what happens. Your share goes here. Your effects are distributed thus. The crew has obligations toward your memory that survive your departure from the manifest. This was not how the merchant marine treated its dead. This was not how the Navy treated its dead. The Navy, in fact, was notorious throughout the early modern period for the sheer administrative cruelty with which it handled the wages of deceased sailors, with claims by widows and orphans frequently disappearing into bureaucratic channels from which they never emerged. The pirates wrote a document that solved this problem before it could occur. And here is the part that genuinely staggers if you have not encountered it before. The pirates wrote a document. Most of them couldn't write. The literacy rate among ordinary sailors in the early 18th century was low. Some scholars estimate that a substantial majority of common Atlantic seamen could not read or write at all, and that even among those who possessed some functional literacy, the level was often limited to the recognition of basic words and the production of a signature. The pirates were drawn from this population. They were ordinary sailors who had stepped sideways into outlawry, and they had brought with them the same broad range of literacy and illiteracy that characterized the legitimate maritime workforce. And yet the articles got written. Someone in every pirate crew of any size had enough literacy to draft the document, or at least to transcribe what the crew agreed on. Someone read it aloud to the assembled men so that the illiterate among them, and there were many, could hear what they were agreeing to before they signed. And when the time came to sign, the men who could write signed their names, and the men who could not made their marks. And the document became binding on all of them with the same force, regardless of whether their assent had been recorded in ink letters or in the distinctive X of a man who had never been taught to put his own name on paper. That image, by itself, is one of the most quietly extraordinary scenes in the history of early modern political organization. A group of men, most of them unable to read the document being held in front of them, listening as it is read aloud, asking questions, negotiating particular clauses, and then stepping forward one at a time to bind themselves to its terms by means of marks they have made with their own hands. This is constitutional democracy, operating at the very limits of literacy. This is the social contract being implemented not by Enlightenment philosophers in well-appointed studies, but by working-class men in the close, damp space of a ship's cabin, by candlelight, before sailing into an enterprise that would probably kill most of them within a few years. The articles did other things as well, and we will encounter those in subsequent sections of this documentary. They created the institution of the quartermaster, which we will discuss at length. They specified the rules of injury compensation, which we will discuss next. They govern punishment, dispute resolution, the rotation of duties, and the conduct of business at a level of operational detail that makes them read, even 300 years later, like documents produced by people who genuinely cared about getting it right. But the existence of the document, prior to anything it contained, was the achievement, the decision, made by men who had no examples to draw from and no political tradition to invoke, that the way to organize their common life was to write it down and sign it together. The understanding that authority flowed legitimately from agreement rather than from imposition. The instinct that a community of equals required as a foundational prerequisite, a text that all of those equals had endorsed. The pirates were not theorists. They had not read Hobbes. They had not read Locke. The intellectual world of 17th century political philosophy had not made its way to the lower decks of the merchant fleet in any systematic form. And yet, working from their own experience and their own grievances and their own slowly accumulated sense of what fairness required. They had independently arrived at something that would have been recognizable to those philosophers as a coherent practice of contractual self-government. They wrote it down, and then they signed it, and then they lived inside it. What did the document do for them once it was written? In immediate, practical, daily terms, the most important thing it did was guarantee that their work would be paid for fairly. That is what we should turn to next. Best 3. The equal share. There are professions in the modern world that compensate their senior executives at multiples of their lowest paid workers that would have been considered, in the 18th century, frankly indecent. A chief executive at a major modern corporation might earn in a single year somewhere between 200 and 400 times the salary of the entry-level employee at the same organization. In some particularly dramatic cases, the ratio climbs higher still, into the thousands. These figures are reported often with a kind of resigned shrug, as though they describe a natural condition of human enterprise rather than a specific historical arrangement that could, in principle, be otherwise. It is worth knowing that the pirates would have regarded these ratios as absurd. I do not mean this rhetorically, I mean it operationally. If you had presented a Golden Age pirate crew with a proposal to organize the division of their plunder along the ratios that govern most contemporary corporations, they would have laughed at you, and then they would have voted against you, and then, if you had persisted, they would have begun to wonder what exactly you thought you were doing aboard their ship. The pirate share system was, in its terms, almost shockingly egalitarian by any standard the world has subsequently produced. The captain, the man whose tactical judgment in battle would determine whether the entire crew survived its next engagement, whose force of personality held the enterprise together, whose decisions affected every life aboard, typically received 2 shares of plunder. 2 shares. The common sailor received 1 share. The captain's compensation, in other words, was double that of the lowest paid man on the vessel. Let me put that in modern perspective. If we apply the pirate ratio to a contemporary corporation in which the lowest paid employee earns $40,000 a year, the chief executive would earn $80,000. Not 8 million. Not 80 million. 80,000. The pirate ratio is so far below the modern ratio that the comparison becomes almost difficult to hold in the mind at once, and the captain's 2-share allocation was not even a generous one by Golden Age standards. The articles of some crews specified a 1.5 share for the captain. Some specified 1 1/4. Some captains, particularly when their crews had grown skeptical of any concentration of advantage at the top, accepted compensation that was barely distinguishable from the common share at all. The quartermaster, the second in command, the representative of the crew's interests against any potential abuse of captain authority, the man whose institutional role we will discuss in some detail in a few minutes, received a similar bonus, typically 1.5 to 2 shares. The carpenter, the sailmaker, the surgeon, and other skilled specialists received their proportional allocations, calibrated to the value their specific skills added to the enterprise. The rest, the great majority of the crew, the men who climbed the rigging and loaded the cannon and pulled on the lines and did the daily physical labor that made the entire operation possible, received their 1 share apiece, identically, without distinction. Now compare this to the alternative arrangements available to the same men in the legitimate maritime economy of their era. The Royal Navy distributed prize money, the proceeds of captured enemy vessels, according to a formula that allocated 3/8 of the total to the captain alone. The remaining 5/8 was divided among the rest of the crew, but not equally. Officers received their disproportionate shares, and the common sailors, who were typically the most numerous category aboard, and who had done the bulk of the actual fighting, received a share that was a small fraction of what the captain pocketed. Calculations vary, but in many cases the ratio between a Royal Navy captain's prize money and that of a common sailor under his command could be in the range of 300 to 1. 300 to 1. Pirate ratios, by comparison, range from 1.25 to 1 to perhaps 3 to 1 in the most extreme cases. The merchant marine was, in some respects, even worse. Wages were withheld for months or years at a time, with sailors having no practical mechanism for ensuring payment except the trust of an employer who had every legal advantage and many practical incentives to delay or simply not pay at all. Sailors who had completed a full voyage could find themselves, on arrival in port, paid in scrip that could only be redeemed at company stores at inflated prices, or paid late, or paid less than promised, or in some cases not paid at all, with no recourse beyond a legal system that was structurally aligned against them. Compare that, for a moment, to the experience of pirate plunder distribution. The articles specified in advance what each man would receive. The plunder was assembled in a common pile, evaluated and divided according to the agreed terms before anyone left the deck. The transaction was complete the same day, in front of witnesses, with the document in hand to settle any disputes that arose during the calculation. There was no waiting. There was no scrip. There was no employer with the power to withhold what had been agreed. You worked, you took the prize, you got your share. Today, in your hand, to do with as you wished. The psychological consequences of this arrangement were considerable. Men who had spent their entire working lives waiting on payment that might or might not arrive in the form it had been promised, suddenly found themselves in an economy that paid immediately, transparently, and fairly. The relief of this is difficult to overstate. The sheer cognitive load that had been freed up by no longer having to worry about whether the next paycheck would arrive in full, or in part, or at all, must have been one of the genuine quality of life improvements that pirate articles provided. And then there was the magnitude. A common sailor in the legitimate maritime economy might earn somewhere between £15 and £30 in a year, if everything went well, and his employer paid as promised. A single prosperous pirate cruise, and there were many such cruises during the height of the Golden Age, could produce a per-man share considerably larger than that. A really exceptional cruise could produce a per-man share that exceeded a decade of legitimate maritime wages. Bartholomew Roberts captured a Portuguese treasure ship off the coast of Brazil in 1719 that was carrying, among other cargo, an enormous quantity of gold coin and jewels destined for the King of Portugal. The per-man share from that single capture, by some estimates, exceeded what an ordinary sailor could expect to earn in 20 years of legitimate employment. This was not the norm. Most pirate cruises produced more modest results, and many produced nothing at all. The expected value of pirate work, calculated across the entire career trajectory of an ordinary crew member, was probably comparable to, or perhaps slightly better than, legitimate alternatives, especially once you accounted for the high probability of death or capture that the profession entailed. The pirates were not getting rich on average. They were getting rich in occasional moments of spectacular success, surrounded by long stretches of grinding labor and waiting and incidental violence. But the structure of the deal, the equality of the share, the transparency of the division, the immediacy of the payment, the absence of the long delays and casual cheating that characterized the legitimate economy, that structure was, for the men inside it, a genuine improvement on what they had known before. And the deal got better still when something went wrong, because the articles did not only specify what you would be paid for success, they specified what you would be paid if you were hurt, yes, for workers' compensation. Let me ask you a question. If you were injured at work tomorrow, seriously injured, in a way that prevented you from doing the kind of work you have been doing, what would happen? In most modern societies, some version of an answer exists. There are workers' compensation systems of varying generosity and accessibility that exist to provide some financial cushion against the consequences of workplace injury. There are disability benefits. There are unions where unions still operate. that have negotiated specific provisions for their members. There are private insurance products that some employers offer, and some do not. The answer to the question varies enormously by country, by industry, by your specific employment situation, and by the particular nature of the injury. But in most cases, the answer is at least something. Something would happen. The catastrophe would not be left entirely on your shoulders. This is a relatively recent development. The recognition that workers injured in the course of their work were entitled to compensation from someone other than themselves is, in the long arc of human labor history, a development of the late 19th and 20th centuries. The systems that we now take for granted are barely 100 years old in their modern form, and they were achieved against fierce resistance from employers who regarded the principle itself, that they bore any obligation to workers whose bodies they had used up, as a violation of natural law. In 1721, the principle was extraordinary. In 1721, the principle, where it existed at all, existed primarily as charity rather than as right. A worker injured on the job in legitimate maritime employment had no enforceable claim against his employer for the consequences of that injury. He might receive some assistance from his community, or from a charitable organization, or from the goodwill of an unusually generous employer who chose to provide for him voluntarily. But he had no contractual right to anything. The pirates wrote contractual rights to injury compensation into the articles. These provisions are documented in multiple surviving articles across the Golden Age, and the figures are specific enough to suggest they had been worked out through experience and revised over time. The articles of Bartholomew Roberts specify the standard schedule, and other crews adopted variations on similar terms. Lose your right arm in service. And given that fighting was the work, this was not a remote contingency but a foreseeable occupational hazard, and you were entitled to 600 pieces of 8, drawn from the common fund before any other division of plunder took place. 600 pieces of 8 was, in the economic context of the early 18th century, a substantial sum of money. It was not enough to retire comfortably on for the rest of your life, but it was enough to establish yourself in some less physical line of work, or to purchase a small property in one of the port cities sympathetic to former pirates, or to provide a meaningful cushion against the consequences of an injury that had ended your ability to do the work you knew how to do. Lose your left arm, and the figure was slightly different, typically 500 pieces of 8, on the rationale that the left arm was, for most men, the less essential of the two, and that the loss represented a smaller proportional reduction in working capacity. Lose your right leg, and the schedule specified 500 pieces of 8. Lose your left leg, 400. Lose an eye, 100. Lose a finger, 100. Each scenario had been considered in advance, assigned a value, and incorporated into the document, so that the man who lost the relevant body part in the course of his work knew, before the loss occurred, exactly what would be coming to him. The compensation was paid from a common fund, typically the first allocation drawn from any prize, before the individual shares were distributed. This is a structural detail that matters, because it means the injured crew member's payment was not coming out of anyone's individual share. It was coming off the top, before the division. The entire crew was, in effect, paying collective premiums on a kind of insurance policy that covered each of them against the consequences of injury. You worked, in other words, with men who had all agreed in advance to take care of you if something happened to you in the course of your common work, and you had agreed to take care of them. The articles converted an abstract human obligation, the recognition that men who fight together owe each other something beyond the immediate transaction, into a specific financial mechanism, calibrated, written down, and enforced by the same community that had created it. And the system covered more than just amputation. The articles typically provided for ongoing care of severely wounded men, for the maintenance of the disabled aboard the vessel, until they could be set up in a sustainable post-pirate life on shore. for the burial of the dead with what passed for appropriate ceremony in their world. The framework was, in its essential shape, the framework of a benefit scheme. A comprehensive employer provided package of protections against the foreseeable risks of the work. 300 years later, in many parts of the world, workers in dangerous professions still struggle to secure protections that pirates wrote into their contracts as a matter of course. The implications are sobering when you sit with them. We sometimes congratulate ourselves on the moral progress of modernity, on the long arc of social development that has produced the workplace protections we now consider normal. And much of that congratulation is warranted. The systems that protect modern workers from the worst consequences of workplace injury are genuine achievements, hard-won over generations of labor organizing and political struggle, and bitter negotiation against the interests of capital. But the achievement, considered carefully, is the recovery of something that small groups of outlaws had already worked out on their own 3 centuries ago, and that the legitimate world had then spent a long time refusing to adopt, despite having the example readily available to it. The pirates, in other words, had functioning workers' compensation before the concept of workers' compensation had been formally articulated in any of the major political traditions of the European world. They had it because they needed it, because they had experienced the alternative, and because they had been given, by their own social organization, the latitude to write themselves a different deal. It was not perfect. The fund was not always sufficient to pay out all claims in full. The system relied on continued pirate success to remain solvent, which meant that crews who had a string of unsuccessful cruises could find themselves unable to honor their own articles. And the rough conditions of pirate medicine meant that many men who would today receive simple antibiotic treatment and full recovery instead became candidates for the compensation schedule, because the alternative to amputation in the early 18th century was often death by infection. But within those limits, the system worked. Men who lost limbs were paid. Men who lost eyes were paid. The community that had agreed to take care of them in the event of their injury did take care of them on the terms specified, with the predictability that contractual obligation provides. It was one of the genuine practical advantages of the pirate life, and it was protected, like all the other advantages we have been discussing, by a specific institutional figure whose existence on the ship served as a structural counterweight to any concentration of power at the top. That figure was the quartermaster, and he is who we will turn to next. Best 5. The quartermaster. If you had to choose a single piece of evidence to demonstrate that the Golden Age pirates were operating something genuinely sophisticated, rather than merely improvising as they went, you could do worse than to point to the institution of the quartermaster. The quartermaster was, in the most literal and operational sense, the second most important person aboard a pirate vessel, but his role was not what the rank implies in modern military terminology. He was not the captain's deputy. He was not the executive officer who carried out the captain's orders and stood ready to assume command in the captain's absence. He was something stranger than that, something for which the modern world has not produced a perfect analogue, and which requires a moment of careful explanation to fully appreciate. The quartermaster was the crew's representative against the captain. He was elected by the crew, like the captain, in his own separate election. He held office as long as the crew continued to support him, and he could be removed by the crew if he failed in his duties. His position derived its legitimacy, not from the captain's appointment, but from the same democratic mechanism that had legitimized the captain himself. He was, in this specific sense, a parallel power center on the vessel, a counterbalance built into the constitutional structure of the ship for the specific purpose of preventing any single individual from accumulating the kind of authority that legitimate captains possessed. Consider what the quartermaster did. He was the keeper of the ship's stores. The provisions, the weapons, the gunpowder, the supplies, all of it was under his administrative control rather than the captain's. This was not a casual division of labor. It was a deliberate structural decision that recognized the simple fact that whoever controlled the resources of the vessel controlled the vessel, and that placing the resources in the hands of someone other than the captain prevented the captain from leveraging access to food and weapons into a form of personal power over the crew. He distributed the plunder. After a successful capture, the goods taken from the prize were assembled, evaluated, and divided according to the articles. And the quartermaster was the man responsible for ensuring that the division was conducted fairly. He counted the shares. He oversaw the disbursement. He answered to the crew, not to the captain, for the integrity of the calculation. A captain who tried to skim from the proceeds would have to do so through, or in opposition to, the quartermaster. And the quartermaster's institutional position gave him both the authority and the incentive to resist any such attempt. He represented the crew in disputes. If a sailor had a grievance against the captain, a complaint about treatment, a disagreement about a tactical decision, a dispute over the interpretation of the articles, the quartermaster was the person to whom that grievance was brought, and the quartermaster was the person who advanced it on the sailor's behalf. He functioned, in this respect, as something between an ombudsman and a union representative, with formal standing to challenge the captain's conduct on the crew's behalf, and with the institutional mandate to ensure that the captain's authority remained within its agreed limits. He was the boarding officer in most engagements. When a pirate vessel took a prize, it was typically the quartermaster who led the boarding party onto the captured ship, who assessed its cargo, who negotiated with the captive crew, who made the immediate operational decisions about what to take and what to leave and how to handle the prisoners. This was both a practical division of labor. The captain remained with his ship while the quartermaster managed the prize, and a further institutionalization of the principle that the rewards of the enterprise belonged to the crew collectively, with the quartermaster as their designated representative in the moment of acquisition, and in matters that did not directly involve combat. The day-to-day governance of life aboard the vessel, the resolution of disputes between crewmates, the application of the articles to specific situations that arose during the voyage. The quartermaster was often the principal authority. The captain commanded in battle and in matters of immediate operational urgency. The quartermaster managed the ordinary business of communal life. It was a division of labor that recognized the distinct nature of these two domains and assigned them to two distinct individuals, each accountable to the crew, but each operating in his own sphere. The institution had no real precedent in the legitimate maritime world of the era. Royal Navy and merchant vessels operated under the captain's near-total authority, with no equivalent role designed to check that authority on behalf of the crew. The quartermaster on a Royal Navy vessel was an ordinary officer with administrative responsibilities, subordinate to the captain in every meaningful respect, and entirely without the institutional standing that the pirate quartermaster possessed. Where did the institution come from? The honest historical answer is that we do not entirely know. The pirate articles seem to have emerged through a process of accumulated practice and refinement, with individual crews adapting their arrangements based on what had worked for previous crews and what had failed in their own experience. Some scholars have traced the origins of the quartermaster role to the buccaneer culture of the 17th century Caribbean, where the predecessors of the Golden Age pirates had been developing similar institutional arrangements for several generations before the High Age of piracy properly began. Others see in it a creative adaptation of various structural features of legitimate maritime life, repurposed for the very different needs of an outlaw community. What we can say with confidence is that by the height of the Golden Age, the institution was nearly universal among pirate crews of any size, and that it functioned with sufficient effectiveness that captains who tried to circumvent it generally found themselves in serious trouble. The quartermaster's authority was not theoretical. It was real, exercised in real situations, and backed by the crew that had elected him. There is a particular human reality worth pausing on here. The men who served as quartermasters were, in many cases, men who could have been captains. They possessed the leadership qualities, the operational competence, the force of personality that captaincy required. The fact that they accepted the quartermaster's role instead, a role with comparable but differently distributed responsibility, with similar but slightly reduced share allocations, with no possibility of the personal glory that attached to the captain's position, tells you something about the genuine commitment of these men to the institutional logic of what they were building. They could have competed for the top job. Some of them chose instead to serve as the institutional counterweight to the top job, because the institutional counterweight was what the system needed to function. There is something in this that resembles the political maturity of much older and more deliberately constructed democracies, the recognition that distributing power among multiple offices, each accountable in its own way, produces better outcomes than concentrating power in any single office, no matter how qualified the individual occupant might be. The pirates understood this. The pirates lived it. And in doing so, they produced an institution that has no perfect equivalent in modern political life. Because modern political life has not yet figured out how to give every ordinary worker a representative with the kind of standing that the pirate quartermaster routinely possessed. But the protection of the quartermaster was only one dimension of the protection the articles provided. The other dimension was even more direct. If the captain became genuinely intolerable, the crew did not have to wait until the next election cycle to do anything about it. The crew could simply remove him. B.E. Est 6. The right to depose your captain. There is something almost vertiginously satisfying about the next revision we are going to discuss, and it is the satisfaction of contemplating an arrangement that addresses a problem nearly every working person in the modern world has experienced at some point in their career. The problem is the bad boss. You know what I am referring to. The person somewhere above you in the hierarchy whose decisions affect your daily life, and over whom you have, for all practical purposes, no control. The person whose judgment you have come to doubt, whose competence you have come to question, whose treatment of you and your colleagues has fallen below the threshold of what you would consider reasonable. The person whose continued presence in their position is a fact of your life that you have learned to work around, because the alternative, actually doing something about it, is, in most modern employment arrangements, structurally impossible. You can quit. That option remains available, but quitting carries costs. You lose your income, your benefits, your tenure, your institutional knowledge, your relationships with colleagues, the entire infrastructure of your professional life. Quitting is the most powerful weapon you possess against the bad boss, and like most powerful weapons, it tends to hurt the person wielding it considerably more than the person it is aimed at. What you cannot do, in most modern employment arrangements, is fire the boss. You can complain to human resources. You can document the problems. You can talk to colleagues and discover that your concerns are shared and widespread. You can even, in some cases, escalate the matter to senior leadership and hope that something will be done. But the direct, immediate, structural power to remove the bad boss from their position, that power resides somewhere above you, with people whose interests do not always align with your own, and who have considerations beyond your daily working conditions that they will be weighing in any decision they make. The pirates had this power. The pirates had it as a matter of course, written into the articles, exercisable at any time the crew decided to exercise it, without appeal to any higher authority, and without consequence for the men who exercised it. If the captain was not working out, you voted him out. That was the procedure. It was not complicated. It was not bureaucratic. It did not require lengthy investigation or formal proceedings, or the involvement of distant institutional actors who might or might not understand the situation. The crew met, the question was put, the votes were counted, and if the count went against the captain was no longer the captain. Someone else was elected to replace him, and the voyage continued under new leadership. There are documented cases of this happening. Pirate captains who were removed mid-voyage by their own crews for decisions that the crew judged to be poor, for missed opportunities, for excessive caution, for excessive recklessness, for failure to maintain the morale and discipline of the men. The deposed captain did not typically lose his life or his share of accumulated plunder. He simply lost his rank. He became an ordinary crew member, with an ordinary share, subject to the authority of the new captain, whom the crew had chosen instead. This was extraordinary. This was, in the context of the early 18th century, almost beyond extraordinary. Captains in any other maritime arrangement could not be removed by their crews under any circumstances short of mutiny, which was a capital offense punishable by hanging, and which the law took with the greatest possible seriousness, precisely because it represented the only practical mechanism by which crews could remove captains they no longer trusted. The pirates had eliminated the need for mutiny by building into their articles the regular, peaceful, legally constituted procedure for accomplishing the same end. The implications of this for the captain's behavior were significant. A pirate captain who knew that his crew could replace him at any time had powerful incentives to govern in ways that the crew would tolerate. He had to listen. He had to consult. He had to take seriously the concerns of his men, because their concerns could be converted, with relatively little procedural difficulty, into his unemployment. The institutional check on his authority was not theoretical. It was immediate and continuous and present in every decision he made. This produced a particular style of captaincy that the Hollywood version of piracy has not really captured. The successful pirate captains were typically not the most autocratic men available. They were not the bullies and the tyrants who imposed their will on cowed subordinates. They were the politicians. They were the men who could read the mood of a crew, who could explain their reasoning in ways that made sense to ordinary sailors, who could build consensus around their proposals before any vote was formally required, who understood that leadership in a democratic context was a continuous performance of legitimacy rather than a status that could be claimed and then maintained without further effort. Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate of the entire Golden Age, was by all accounts an extraordinarily charismatic and intelligent man who understood his crews and managed them with what biographers have described as a kind of natural political genius. He did not impose his decisions. He persuaded the crew to share them. The result was a captaincy of remarkable durability. Roberts was never removed by his crew, despite presiding over them through years of operations and many difficult decisions, because he had mastered the art of making his crew believe that his decisions were also their decisions. Compare this to the captaincy of Howell Davis, the man under whom Roberts had originally served before being elected to replace him after Davis's death in a Portuguese ambush. Davis was likewise a politically skilled captain who had been elected by his crew and who had maintained his position through his own capacity to keep his men with him. The pattern is consistent. The captains who lasted were the captains who could lead through persuasion and shared judgment rather than through command. The captains who could not, the ones whose temperament inclined toward autocracy, whose decisions were poor, whose treatment of their crews was inadequate. Those captains tended not to last long. They were removed. They were replaced. The system worked. There is one further dimension to this that deserves explicit attention. The captain's reduced authority during ordinary operations was complemented by significantly expanded authority during battle. The articles typically provided that in moments of immediate combat, the captain's word was final, and his orders were to be obeyed without consultation. This expansion was specifically designed to address the practical reality that committees cannot effectively conduct cannon fire, that battle requires unified command structure and rapid decision-making, and that the egalitarian principles that governed ordinary life aboard the vessel had to be temporarily suspended in moments when the survival of the entire crew depended on coordinated action under unified command. This was a sophisticated piece of constitutional design. The same document that limited the captain's authority in ordinary times also expanded it in extraordinary times, recognizing that different circumstances required different distributions of authority and building both modes into the same framework. The captain who attempted to extend his battle authority into ordinary times faced the prospect of removal. The captain who attempted to abandon his battle authority in moments of crisis faced the prospect of disaster. The articles distinguished between the two modes and provided clear rules for which applied when. The pirates had figured this out. They had figured out, 3 centuries before modern political science had a developed vocabulary for it, that constitutional government required not the absolute limitation of executive authority, but the careful calibration of executive authority across different operational contexts. And the man making the calibration was you, the voting member of the crew, the signatory to the articles. You had a remarkable amount of power in this small floating society, and much of what you had came from the fact that the society itself had been deliberately designed to welcome people that the rest of the world had refused to welcome. It is to that diversity that we will turn next. BEE Best 7, The Diverse Brotherhood. At the top of the hierarchy were the European aristocracies, the small populations of titled families who possessed land, wealth, political power, and the assumption of natural superiority that goes with all of these things. Below them were the commercial classes of the major European cities, merchants, bankers, ship owners, and the increasingly powerful figures whose money rather than their bloodlines provided their standing. Below them were the various categories of ordinary European subjects, farmers, artisans, soldiers, sailors, servants, and the broad mass of the laboring population who supplied the muscle for the economy and the bodies for the armies and the navies. Below them were the various populations classified as outsiders, Jews in most of Europe, Roma populations, religious minorities of various kinds, all of whom occupied positions of varying precariousness depending on local conditions and the particular prejudices of the local authorities. And below all of those, at the bottom of the hierarchy, as the early 18th century understood it, were the populations subjected to the Atlantic slave trade. The trade had been operating at industrial scale for over a century by the time we're discussing, and the populations of African origin who had been transported, sold, and worked across the Caribbean and the American colonies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The institution of chattel slavery, the legal definition of human beings as property, transferable, inheritable, and entirely without standing as persons under the law of the societies that had created the institution, was the foundational economic arrangement of the Atlantic plantation economy, and it was defended, throughout the period, with a comprehensiveness and a brutality that the modern imagination genuinely struggles to fully absorb. This was the world. This was the architecture of human relationship within which the pirates were operating. And the pirates, more than any other significant social grouping of their era, did something with this architecture that has never received the recognition it deserves. They ignored it. Not entirely. Not perfectly. The pirates carried their prejudices with them, like all human beings carry their prejudices with them, and the historical record contains plenty of evidence that the egalitarian ideals written into the articles were not always perfectly applied in practice. But the baseline, the contractual baseline, the institutional baseline, the structural baseline, was something different from anything else available in the Atlantic world of the era. The pirate ship did not distinguish by race in its written articles. A man's vote was a man's vote, regardless of where he had been born or what color his skin happened to be. A man's share was a man's share, calibrated to his role aboard the vessel. rather than to any categorical identity he carried. A man's right to be heard in disputes, to participate in the election of officers, to receive injury compensation, to be treated as an equal member of the community. These rights, on paper, did not vary by race, and in practice, with all the imperfections of practice, the articles were applied with sufficient consistency that the racial composition of pirate crews looked dramatically different from the racial composition of any other significant maritime workforce of the era. At the height of the Golden Age, somewhere between a quarter and a third of all Caribbean pirate crew members were of African descent. Some crews ran higher, some ran lower. The variation reflected the specific origins and recruitment patterns of individual crews, but the overall pattern was clear. Pirate ships were black and white and brown, sailing together, governed by the same articles, sharing the same risks and the same rewards. Many of these black crew members had come from the slave ships directly. The pirates were active raiders of slave shipping, partly for the commercial value of the cargo, partly for the strategic value of the vessels themselves, and partly, for at least some pirates, for reasons that look in retrospect like genuine ideological commitment to opposition to the trade. When a slave ship was taken, the holds were opened, and the men and women chained below were offered a choice that no other institution in the Atlantic world was offering them. Join us. Sign the articles. Take your share. Be subject to the same rules and the same rights as everyone else aboard. The choice was not a trivial one. Pirate life was dangerous, and many of the men who signed the articles would die within a few years. But the alternative, return to the plantation economy, continuation of the lives they had been forcibly removed from in Africa, lifelong enslavement under conditions calibrated to extract maximum economic value from their bodies before discarding them. That alternative was, by any honest accounting, worse. Many chose to join, and when they joined, the articles meant what they said. We have established this point already in our discussions of the vote, the share, the injury compensation. The articles did not contain separate provisions for differently raced crew members. They contained provisions for crew members, and the crew members signed them on the same terms regardless of where they had come from. There were black pirate captains, Diego el Mulatto, in the 17th century, Black Caesar, who sailed with Blackbeard, various other figures whose names have been preserved imperfectly, but whose existence is documented. The captaincy itself was open to anyone who could secure the votes of the crew, and there is no record of any pirate crew refusing to elect a qualified candidate on grounds of race. The Indian Ocean pirates incorporated Malagasy, Arab, and South Asian sailors. The Atlantic pirates incorporated, alongside their African members, men of mixed European-American indigenous heritage from the colonial frontiers, Jewish sailors who had found in pirate communities one of the few places in the Atlantic world where their religious identity was simply irrelevant to their standing among their crewmates, and the full range of European ethnic and national identities that the period possessed. What you found on a pirate ship was a community more genuinely diverse than anything else operating anywhere on Earth at scale. A community whose composition reflected not the demographic arrangements of any single society, but the deliberate disregard of those arrangements in favor of a different and more inclusive principle. This is not a small thing. This is not a footnote. The fact that working-class men in the early 18th century, drawing on no significant intellectual tradition that would have given them the vocabulary for what they were doing, independently arrived at a practice of multiracial cooperation under contractual equality. This is one of the more genuinely remarkable developments in the social history of the Atlantic world, and it has been almost entirely missing from the way that history has subsequently been told. The Hollywood pirate crew is a band of European outcasts. The historical pirate crew was something stranger and more radical, a floating experiment in equality, however flawed in execution. that conducted itself in the open ocean while the world on shore was still centuries away from catching up to its written terms. The brotherhood was real, not a brotherhood of inheritance or birth, but a brotherhood of choice. The men who sat together in those candlelit cabins and signed those articles were choosing each other across every line that the world outside the ship was using to keep them apart. That choice was, in itself, one of the best things about being a pirate. But it was a choice made possible by the fact that the alternative life, the life on legitimate vessels, had become, for so many of these men, genuinely unendurable. To understand what they had chosen, we have to understand what they had escaped. We need to talk about the press gang. BEST 8. Freedom from the press gang. Imagine for a moment walking down the street of a port city in the early 18th century. Portsmouth, Plymouth, Bristol. Perhaps one of the major American colonial ports like Boston or Charleston. Imagine doing some entirely ordinary thing. Walking from a tavern to your lodgings, carrying a purchase home from the market, returning from a visit to a friend or a family member, or a romantic partner who had been waiting for you. And imagine, at some point during this entirely ordinary walk, that a group of armed men descends on you from somewhere you had not been watching, restrains you, and informs you that you are now a member of the Royal Navy. This is not an exercise in dystopian fiction. This is what happened to real human beings, with real lives and real families, on a regular and systematic basis, throughout the long 18th century and into the 19th. The practice was called impressment, and the men who carried it out were called press gangs, and they constituted one of the most legally sanctioned and widely practiced forms of state-organized kidnapping in the history of the modern world. The Royal Navy needed sailors. The Royal Navy needed them in quantities that voluntary recruitment could not reliably supply, particularly during the periodic wars that consumed so much of the 18th century, and the legal framework of the period gave the Navy the authority to obtain those sailors by force, by sending out parties of armed men to seize able-bodied males from the streets and waterfronts of port cities and conscript them into service. The legal niceties around the practice, who could be taken, who was protected, what kinds of resistance were permitted, varied over time and were subject to ongoing political controversy. But the fundamental fact of impressment, the basic reality that the state could and did take men from their lives and put them on warships against their will, was one of the defining conditions of working-class maritime life throughout the period. You were a working sailor in a British port. You were therefore, at all times, in danger of being impressed. The danger was real. The danger was widespread. The danger was something that ordinary sailors managed with the same kind of low-grade chronic anxiety that modern people might manage. The danger of street crime or traffic accidents, knowing that the odds in any given evening were against catastrophe, but that the catastrophe, when it came, would arrive without warning. And once you had been pressed, the conditions of your service were governed by the institutional logic of the Royal Navy of the early 18th century, which was, and this is being said by historians, not by partisans, one of the more brutal and dehumanizing employment environments available anywhere in the Atlantic world. The food was inadequate. The pay was poor and frequently withheld. The discipline was savage, with floggings administered for offenses that would not have warranted a verbal reprimand in any reasonable workplace. The medical care, when it existed, was rudimentary at best. The mortality rates from disease alone were staggering, with shipboard outbreaks of scurvy, typhus, dysentery, and various tropical illnesses, killing sailors in numbers that exceeded the casualties from actual combat by significant margins. And the term of service was, in practical terms, indefinite. Men who had been pressed into the Navy could expect to remain there for as long as the Navy required their services, which often meant years, sometimes decades, sometimes until they died of one of the many causes the Navy provided. This was the alternative. This was what pirate life was, in significant part, an escape from. It is essential to grasp this if you want to understand the moral architecture of the golden age of piracy. The men who turned to piracy were not, by and large, men who had been living comfortable lives on shore, and who had decided to abandon those lives in favor of adventure on the high seas. They were men who had already been at sea, often for years, under conditions of legalized brutality that the modern imagination has difficulty fully holding in view. They knew what legitimate maritime employment looked like. They had lived inside it. They had felt the lash on their backs and watched their crewmates die of preventable causes, and worked for wages that were withheld or reduced or stolen with the casual indifference of employers who knew their employees had no recourse. When these men signed pirate articles, they were not choosing piracy over comfort. They were choosing piracy over a particular kind of unfreedom that had been the operational reality of their working lives. And the pirate articles were attractive to them, not because they offered some abstract utopian vision, but because they specifically and concretely addressed the specific and concrete grievances of men who had been treated as disposable property by the legitimate maritime institutions of their era. The freedom from impressment was, in this context, the foundational freedom that all the other freedoms rested on. Pirates could not be pressed. Pirate ships did not work on the basis of forced conscription. Every man aboard a pirate vessel had chosen to be there, had walked aboard voluntarily, signed the articles freely, and committed himself to the enterprise on his own terms. The voluntariness was not theoretical. It was the actual mechanism by which the ship was crewed, and the voluntariness ran in the other direction as well. You could leave. The articles typically provided for the ability of crew members to depart at the next port, taking their accumulated share with them, free to make whatever subsequent life choices their resources permitted. This was the opposite of impressment. This was the right of free movement, the right of free contract, the right to enter and exit employment on terms of your own choosing. The rights that the legitimate maritime institutions of the era specifically and systematically denied to the men who worked for them. You signed up because you wanted to. You stayed because you wanted to. You left when you wanted to. The whole arrangement operated on the basis of consent that the legitimate world did not require its workers to give. The psychological effect of this was significant in ways that go beyond the immediate practical advantages. Men who've been working under coercion for years, who have grown accustomed to the experience of having their labor commanded rather than offered, who have lost the sense of themselves as agents in their own working lives. Those men, when they enter a working environment that operates on the basis of voluntary participation, often find that something they had not realized they had lost begins to return. The pirates called it freedom. They used the word with a directness and a frequency that the historical record has preserved, and that the literature of the period has often quoted with a kind of slight embarrassment, as though the men who said it could not really have meant it in any serious sense. They meant it. They meant it specifically. They had felt the absence of it on the legitimate vessels they had escaped from, and they were determined to preserve it on the vessels they had built to replace those legitimate ones. The black flag was not merely a symbol of lawlessness. It was a symbol of liberation, and the liberation was concrete, specific, and contractually defined. Once you were free, of course, you had to spend your freedom on something, and the place where you spent it, more than any other in the Golden Age world, was a city on the southern coast of Jamaica that has become a legend in its own right. It is to that city that we will turn next. Best 9, Port Royal. And the spending. There are places in the historical record that exist at the boundary between document and dream, and Port Royal, Jamaica is one of them. It exists. It existed. There is no doubt about its physical reality. You can travel today to the spit of land at the entrance to Kingston Harbour and stand on what remains of it. And you can see the place where, for a period of roughly 30 years in the late 17th century, one of the most extraordinary urban environments in human history briefly came into being. The remains are modest now. Most of what made Port Royal famous is gone, dropped, dramatically and almost biblically, into the harbour in the great earthquake of June 1692 that sent two-thirds of the city beneath the water in a matter of minutes and ended the Port Royal era as definitively as anything in the historical record has ever been ended. But for those 3 decades before the earthquake, Port Royal was something the world had not quite seen before, and has not seen quite again since. It was the unofficial capital of the Caribbean privateer economy, the staging ground from which raids on Spanish shipping were launched, and to which the proceeds of those raids returned to be spent. It was, by the descriptions of contemporary visitors who survived their visits and lived to write about them, simultaneously the richest and the wickedest city in the world, a place where the accumulated wealth of the entire Spanish Main flowed through the pockets of men who had taken it by force and had no intention of letting it remain in those pockets for more than the time required to spend it. The taverns of Port Royal were legendary. The contemporary accounts describe ratios that strain credulity. 1 drinking establishment for every 10 residents, by some estimates, which sounds impossible until you consider who the residents were and what they were doing there. The drinking establishments operated more or less continuously, day and night, serving customers who had arrived with substantial quantities of money and considerable enthusiasm for parting with it. The rum flowed, the wine flowed, the accumulated alcoholic beverages of the Caribbean trade routes flowed in quantities that beggared the imaginations of visitors from the more temperate cities of the European world into the gathered population of a city that had organized itself with admirable directness around the principles of hedonistic consumption. It was, in the modern terms that perhaps make the most sense for understanding it, the original adult playground. Las Vegas without the casinos but with the same general principle. New Orleans during Mardi Gras except every day and with cannons. Bangkok in a certain era except with more parrots. The specific cultural template has been reproduced in modified forms in various cities and various periods since, but Port Royal at its peak was the original. The city that had specifically constructed itself, brick by brick, and tavern by tavern, around the proposition that men who had recently come into money should be provided with every possible mechanism for spending that money on immediate experience. The gambling was extensive. Every variety of the gaming arts available in the early modern world had found its way to Port Royal, where it operated for clienteles whose attitude toward money was specifically calibrated to make the gaming arts profitable for those running them. Men who had taken their wealth by force, who had accepted the high probability that they would never live to spend most of it, who had internalized at a foundational level the principle that the future was uncertain and the present was here, threw themselves into games of chance with an abandon that more conservative populations would have found alarming. The brothels were numerous and varied. The food was lavish. The clothing, and this is a thread worth pulling on for a moment, the clothing was an entire economy of its own. Port Royal merchants imported silks, embroidered fabrics, decorative buttons, gold and silver braid, hats of every variety, footwear of impressive quality, and the full range of accessories that the well-dressed gentleman of the period was expected to display. And the pirates, who had a documented passion for fine dress that has been somewhat understated in the popular imagination of who they were, bought all of it. The peacock pirate, the figure of the buccaneer in elaborate, impractical, gorgeously decorated clothing, is not a Hollywood invention. It is documented in the contemporary record. Calico Jack himself, the captain we met earlier in our discussion of Anne Bonny, took his nickname from his fondness for brightly colored calico clothing, and he was not unusual in his crew. He was a representative example of a broader pattern. What was it like to walk down a Port Royal street with a pocket full of pieces of 8 after a successful cruise? The contemporary accounts converge on certain consistent details. The streets were narrow and crowded, with the buildings pressed close together, and the sounds of the harbor immediately audible from anywhere in the city. The crowds were varied: sailors, merchants, prostitutes, gamblers, musicians, soldiers, the visitors from the rural areas of Jamaica who had come to participate in the famous nightlife and to spectate at the spectacle of it. The languages overlapped. English predominantly, but with significant French, Dutch, Spanish, and various African languages represented among the populations who had ended up there for various reasons. The music came out of every doorway. The food smelled extraordinary. The available stimulations of the human nervous system were laid out in front of you with a comprehensiveness that no other city in the period could have matched. And you had money. Real money. The kind of money that legitimate employment could not have produced. The kind of money that made you, briefly and intensely, one of the wealthier people in the immediate environment, with the full set of options that significant wealth provides. You ate, you drank, you found company, you gambled, you bought beautiful and impractical things, you stayed up later than you had any reasonable right to stay up. You woke the next morning with a hangover and a slightly lighter purse and a fresh set of stories that you would carry with you for as long as the rest of your life happened to last. And then you did it again, until either the money ran out or the next voyage called you back to the ship. This was the spending part of the pirate equation. This was where the treasure went, not into chests buried on remote islands waiting for some future return that the actuarial reality of pirate life made unlikely to occur, into the present moment in Port Royal or in one of the smaller equivalent ports, Tortuga, Nassau, various others, that offered scaled-down versions of the same experience. Was this wise? Was this prudent? Was this the responsible thing to do with the proceeds of one's professional activities? The pirates would not have understood the question. The pirates were operating on a different time horizon than the one that produces such questions. The future was an unreliable proposition for men in their profession, and the present was right here, and the present had Port Royal in it. And Port Royal was a thing that had been built specifically for the kind of money they had and the kind of lives they were living. They spent comprehensively. They spent in ways that the prudent investors of subsequent centuries have looked back on with mixed feelings, partly envy, partly bewilderment, partly the quiet recognition that there might have been something to the approach that the prudent investors had specifically organized their lives to avoid. And in the spending, they reached towards something that had been the underlying motivation of everything we have discussed so far in this documentary. The vote, the articles, the share, the compensation, the quartermaster, the right to depose the captain, the diverse brotherhood, the escape from the press gang. All of these mechanisms were instrumental. They were means to an end. The end was a specific kind of human experience that the legitimate world had not been offering them. The end was freedom, and the freedom itself, as a lived experience rather than as a contractual provision, is what we will close with in our final section. Best 10, the open horizon. We come, in the end, to the part of being a pirate that the contracts and the articles and the institutional arrangements were ultimately in service of, and that none of those documents quite manages to capture in their specific operational language. We come to the horizon. I want you to picture something as we close. Picture standing on the deck of a wooden vessel, approximately 70 feet long, on a clear morning, somewhere in the open Caribbean in the year 1718. The wind is steady from the east. The sails are full. The water beneath you is the particular color that the Caribbean water becomes when the sky is right and the angle is right. A blue that does not exist on any other body of water on Earth, and that has caused poets considerable difficulty in their efforts to describe it adequately. The deck moves beneath your feet in the slow, breathing rhythm of a ship under sail in moderate seas, the rhythm that human beings have always found. at some level beneath conscious recognition, deeply satisfying. You are looking forward. You are looking out at the open ocean. And here is what is in front of you. Nothing, or more precisely, anything. Anything you choose, in any direction you decide to point your vessel, for as far as your vessel can carry you. There is no edge of the world out there waiting to stop you. There is no governmental authority projecting its power into the empty miles that begin, where you can see the surface of the water start to curve away from the deck. There is, for the practical purposes of your immediate life, nothing standing between you and any destination you might be capable of reaching. This is not how human beings have generally lived. This is not how human beings live now. The horizon in front of most of us most of the time is structured. It contains the places we are expected to go and the places we are not. It contains the institutions whose authority will be applied to us in various ways depending on which direction we point ourselves. It contains, in the deep architecture of our daily experience, the constant low hum of being known, of being in databases and on payrolls and in records and within the various overlapping networks of identification that the modern world has built to ensure that we never quite slip the leash of being someone in particular, located somewhere in particular, accountable to particular parties for particular things. The pirates had slipped the leash, the whole leash. The slipping had cost them something. They were now under sentence of death from various authorities, and the costs of being caught were genuine and grim. But in exchange for accepting that cost, they had purchased a particular quality of existence that no other arrangement available in their era had been offering. They had purchased the open horizon. What does this mean, concretely? It means several things. It means that on most mornings, the question of where to go next was an open question, answerable by reference to the practical operational considerations of the moment, but not foreclosed by any prior commitment to be somewhere in particular at a particular time. It means that the standard organizing apparatus of ordinary human life, the schedule, the appointment, the obligation to be present at some specific location at some specific point in the calendar, was largely absent from their daily experience, replaced by the rhythms of weather and wind and the operational needs of the vessel itself. It means that they were, in the most literal sense of an overused word, free, not free, in the abstract philosophical sense that has been the subject of so many treatises, free in the practical, daily, lived sense, free of bosses they had not chosen, free of laws they had not consented to, free of the institutional surveillance that legitimate populations submitted to as the price of legitimate participation in the legitimate economy. The price they paid for this freedom was substantial. They lived under sentence of death. They lived in the constant background awareness that any sail on the horizon might be a naval vessel come to end them. They lived in physical conditions that range from uncomfortable to genuinely brutal: bad food, limited fresh water, cramped quarters, the constant risk of disease, the absence of any meaningful medical care for the routine injuries that the work produced. But the freedom was real, and they had chosen it deliberately, and the contemporary accounts of pirates who were captured and brought to trial frequently mention this freedom in their statements. The specific quality of life on the open ocean, beyond the reach of legitimate authority, governed by their own articles and their own elections, that they had found genuinely worth the risks they had accepted in exchange for it. There is a famous passage in the trial records of one of Bartholomew Roberts's crew, executed in Cape Coast Castle in 1722, after Roberts's defeat by the Royal Navy off the African coast. The condemned man, Walter Kennedy, by some sources, though the attribution is disputed, was asked at his trial to explain why he had become a pirate when legitimate alternatives had been available to him. His reported answer has been preserved in various forms, but the essential content is consistent across the sources. In legitimate life, he said, there was only hard labor for poor wages and the constant supervision of masters who did not care for the men they commanded. In piracy, there was plenty and satisfaction, pleasure and ease, liberty and power. And if the price of these things was the rope at the end, well, a merry life and a short one would be his motto. A merry life and a short one. The phrase has echoed through the literature of piracy ever since, and it has done so because it captures something genuine about the calculation these men were making. They had looked at the alternatives, the legitimate alternatives, the safe alternatives, the alternatives that would let them live longer at the cost of living less, and they had concluded that the trade was not worth it. They wanted the merry life. They were willing to pay for it with the shortness. This is the deepest of the best parts of being a pirate, and it is the one that the modern world has the most difficulty fully understanding. We are not, most of us, organized around this kind of calculation. We are organized around survival, around continuation, around the careful management of risk in service of the longest and most comfortable life we can engineer for ourselves. And this is, in many respects, an excellent way to organize a life. And most of us would not trade it for the pirate alternative if the offer were actually on the table. But the pirates were doing something that ordinary modern life does not really allow us to do, and there is some part of every honest modern observer that recognizes the appeal of what they had, even while declining to imitate them. They were living on their own terms. They were living in the present moment with a directness that our future-oriented economic existence has largely organized us out of. They were operating beyond the reach of every system that defines and constrains and supervises and measures and quantifies and credentials and ranks the rest of us. The horizon was open. The ship moved beneath their feet. The wind was steady from the east. And they had voted, that morning, on where to point the bow. That was the best part of being a pirate. That was the part that has not lost its appeal in 300 years. The black flag is still flying in the imagination of every modern person who has ever stood in a meeting they did not want to attend and looked, briefly, out a window. The longing for what those men had, the open horizon, the chosen community, the contracted equality, the genuine voice in their own collective life, is still there, beneath the surface of the more cautious lives we have decided to lead instead. The pirates lived it, briefly, imperfectly, at terrible cost, but they lived it, and that, at the end of our tour, is perhaps the truest and best thing that can be said about them.